So welcome everyone, 2025, first meeting of the year for the chapter. Um, I'm Chris Watts, as many of you know, I'm the vice president of the chapter. And it's a thrill for us to welcome Dr. Dagmara Zawadzka here this evening. I'll just begin with our land acknowledgement and then do an introduction for Dagmara. But as far as the land acknowledgement goes, the chapter acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our work is situated on the Haldeman Tract. That's the land granted to Six Nations that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. And our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our various chapters and involves things like research and learning and teaching and community building, much of which is centralized in our main office in Toronto. So with that, please allow me to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Dagmara Zawadzka. She received her PhD in art history from the University of Quebec at Montreal. She also holds a BSc degree from the University of Toronto in anthropology and an MA in anthropology from Trent University. Dagmara studies Canadian Shield rock art as well as Indigenous arts, and she's taught a number of courses on Indigenous arts at the University of Quebec at Montreal, the University of Ottawa, and more recently, the University of Montreal. She's published extensively for a young scholar. I've read a lot of her work because I too have an interest in some of the stuff that she tackles. So I've been reading her work, which has been published in the Canadian Journal of Archaeology, the journal Time and Mind, World Archaeology. In fact, I think we were both invited to contribute. Is that right, Dagmara? We both
It's
have, I think,
possible.
chapters in the same special issue
Yeah.
of World Archaeology and Ontario Archaeology as well. She's also collaborated on the first ever virtual exhibit of rock art in Canada, which took place in 2019. It was called Images on Stone, created by the Museum of Civilization in Quebec City and the University of Quebec at Montreal. So it's a real thrill to welcome Dr. Zawadzka here tonight. The title of her talk, as you can see, is Public Rock Art Sites in the Temagami area of Northeastern Ontario. So with that, Dagmara, I can turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. Let me just put my slide on. Oh, can you guys see it?
Yep, looks great.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy I'm the first one for the year. So, today, what I want to talk to you about is the rock art of the Temagami area in Northeastern Ontario and its public rock art sites. That is basically sites that had many functions, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So basically, those are places where other than human persons can be contacted, places that helped to navigate water routes, and places that were possibly implicated in the negotiation of social boundaries. So let's start by setting the scene. So what is Canadian Shield rock art? First and foremost, Canadian Shield is this physiographic region that stretches from Quebec to Saskatchewan, and it's a region that is basically characterized by those immense forests, boreal forests. There's plenty of lakes and rivers, and basically they form this very dense and complex labyrinth across the landscape. And these have been used as travel routes by Algonquin-speaking peoples. And this region is home to a rock art tradition known as Canadian Shield rock art. And this tradition is known for its red ochre pictographs that were painted on vertical waterside cliffs, and petroglyphs, which would have been carved, incised into rocky outcrops, which are also often located near water In one case, we have one in the bush, if you know about Peterborough petroglyphs. And usually they would be incised on horizontal or sloping surfaces. So right now, from what we know, there is around 800 pictograph sites, so sites with paintings, and we know of roughly 30 petroglyph sites and all across the Canadian Shield. So in terms of ages, this tradition extends at least over 2 millennia into the past, but the sites were made well into the 19th century. So it's a very long-lived tradition. In terms of the images, the pictorial content, we have images of animals, which we call zoomorphs. We have anthropomorphs, which are basically human figures. We have items of material culture, so think canoes, for example. And we have depictions of other than human persons as well. So many of those marks that were left on the rocks have also been called abstractions. And there's a lot of what we call abstraction in the Canadian Shield rock art. And it's basically geometric motifs, circles, crosses, series of parallel lines, which are very popular. And there's also a bunch of like indeterminate figures. We don't really basically know what we're looking at. So it's hard to identify it. And what you're seeing on the screen here in red is the Canadian Shield. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but most of the rock art is actually concentrated in Northwestern Ontario. This is where we know about most of the rock art. It's an area that has been explored since the 60s, so there's a lot of scholarship on this area. There's a bunch of sites in Manitoba, some in Saskatchewan. Northeastern Ontario has quite a lot as well. However, again, Northwestern Ontario is where it's at. And Quebec, actually, we only know of roughly 20 sites in Quebec. There hasn't been much scholarship in Quebec, and quite a lot of them, just like in the north of Ontario, have been lost to hydroelectric dams. As you know, in Quebec, they love to make their electricity. So a lot of them have been flooded. So basically Northwestern Ontario, the area from Lake Superior to Lake of the Woods, this is where we have most of the rock art sites, but we are in Northeastern Ontario today, so that's what we're going to discuss. So let's do some theory. So landscapes. We can say that landscapes are basically homes to people's experiences, activities, stories, and memories. And all of these are intimately connected with places, with paths, with the animals within the landscape, the plants, and any other components of this human lived-in world. And Algonquin-speaking peoples of the Canadian Shield, they experience their landscape through what we call relational ontology, where people are holistically immersed within the land, and they cultivate social relationships with other than human components, with its non-human components as well. So animals, plants, weather phenomena. Think, for example, about thunderstorms and thunder being the thunderbirds, who are actually other than human persons. So within this relational ontology, land is animate and implicated in the flow of the vital forces that sustain all life. And land and people are interrelated, and there's a blurring of distinctions among the two, as you can see with this statement on screen, which says, our people talk about me and the land being the same. I am the environment, and the land is one of our very close relatives. And this is by Leroy Little Bear, and he's Blackfoot elder. So more west, but the sentiment, the idea is the same across most, of Canadian Indigenous nations. So certain places, natural phenomena, material culture are actually alive, and they are endowed with agency, so they can act. So places such as mountains, lakes, or rock effigy formations are inhabited with spiritual powers. So this animacy and agency stems from spiritual ideas associated with the physical world and the emergence and they emerge in the process of relational engagement between humans and the objects or places in questions. So material culture and certain location in the landscape can help build and sustain relationships essential for the well-being of human entities. And rock art sites, which served various functions, are among such places. So basically, material culture, drums, for example, are treated as other than human persons. There's this great example from Speck, who was doing his ethnographic research among the Innu people in the north of Quebec, where a medicine man would wake up at night because his drum was calling onto him. He wanted to talk to him, and he would start drumming, and this is how he was communicating with the drum. So places, material culture, some of them can be animate, they are alive, and some of them are literally other than human persons. So rock art is sacred to Indigenous peoples, and these places are linked with other than human persons. Rock art was made by medicine men and vision questing youth, and it is also associated with the Memegweshivuk, and you see the name on the screen. And the Memegweshivuk are basically other than human beings who live within cliffs on water. And most of the time they are described as being very small. Some of the accounts say that they're hairy, they have narrow faces, or they have something special about their noses. And in other accounts, they basically paddle stone canoes, but they are basically said to live within those cliffs along water. So the images are depictions of dream visions, future events. It can also be used for sympathetic magic, and they also convey various teachings within the landscape that affirm the cultural, political, and historical ties of peoples to their territories. And rock art was also implicated in the navigation of this extensive water network, and it helped exchange information in the landscape. So depending on the site, it could have been doing a lot of things. And what you're seeing here on the screen is a site on Lake Temagami. The images are actually here, and what you're seeing, the close-up, is what we think is actually a thunderbird that is being depicted. It's quite abstract, but this is what we think is being depicted. And I know you can't really see it here on the picture, but for some reason, at some point, somebody wanted to scratch this off, this image, and you can kind of still see the scratch marks on the rock. So where is this Temagami area? Where isn't it? Okay, here you go. Okay, so it's an area located in Northeastern Ontario. You see it, oops, sorry, with the red circle. It's roughly here. So it's kind of northeast of Sudbury. And the region encompasses Lake Temagami, which you see here. I still don't know if you can see my cursor. Maybe I should switch it to
No, we can see it, Dagmara.
Oh, you can see it. Oh, but I wanted to do the laser thingy.
Oh, okay.
I haven't done the laser thingy in so long. Highlighter, vanishing pen. Well, I don't know which one it is, so it's been a while. But Temagami, here, the main lake, it's the biggest one. And so the area corresponds roughly to what is known as Ndakimenan, which is the ancestral territory of the local Teme, Agama, Anishinaabe, and you see the names here on the screen. So in the north, the boundary reaches the height of the land right here, roughly, at the bend of the West Montreal River. In the south, the boundary is drawn at the confluence of the Sturgeon River, as well as the Temagami River. And in the west, it's drawn by the Sturgeon River again here. And in the east, it basically reaches the coastline of Temiskaming Lake, sorry, I just have the French name now in my head, Lake Temiskaming. So and that is between the mouths of the Matabitchuan River and the Montreal rivers. So plenty of rivers in the area, of course. And Dakimenan means in Anishinaabemowin, our land. And the name Temagami means deep water, or the place of deep water. So that would be from the name of the lake. Parentheses, there's a lot of lakes in the north like that who basically are called deep water. It's not a special name. There's a totally different topic of, how stuff was being named in the landscapes compared to what we are used to naming stuff. And a lot of them are descriptive toponyms, and a lot of lakes are basically deep lakes, and that's what they are being called. So it is after this lake that the local indigenous people call themselves Temagami Anishinaabe, or the people of the deep water. In terms of the rock art sites, there is at least 54 known pictograph sites. I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear the beep beep, but they're like plowing the snow. So I can hear it. So if you hear it, yeah, they're plowing the snow outside. So yeah, there's roughly like 54 known pictograph sites, and which are located on those vertical waterside cliffs. And there's 49 of them are actually within Dakimenan. And major concentration sites occur on Lake Temagami, the big lake, where there's 23 sites. Animal Nipissing, this lake here, there's 6 sites, and Obabika Lake, which has 5 sites. So basically, the big lakes are basically places where there's a lot of sites, where the sites concentrate. What do we see in terms of images? Where we have canoes with occupants, we have zoomorphs. So we have what we call cervids, so basically representations of moose, deer. We have representations of possible wolf or a dog. We have what looks like to be an otter. So basically we have some representations of animals. We also have powerful beings, such as the thunderbird that I just showed you on the previous slide. We have one representation of what looks like to be a snake with horns. We have quite a lot of anthropomorphic figures, which for the most part are basically stick figures, nothing complicated. And we really have a lot of the so-called abstractions. So circles, crosses, lines, and there's a lot of those lines in the area, parallel lines, single lines, and we also have a lot of those indeterminate figures. And now, just a parenthesis, we call them abstractions because we don't know what they are. For us, they are abstractions. Of course, this is a category that's been created by Western scholars, but it's how we try to make sense of all this pictorial inventory we have across the Canadian Shield. So yeah, so basically, this is the area, and most of the sites concentrate on those big lakes. Some sites are actually also on the smaller lakes and on rivers, but major concentrations are on those lakes. So oh great, now I can't switch. I'm sorry, I just don't. Okay, okay, great. I just had to switch the cursor. It's been a while. We're not used to it anymore. I forgot how to do it. So the Temagami area. So rock art in the Canadian Shield, actually, not only in the Temagami area, it would have served many functions simultaneously. And we know from the research that has been carried around from 1960s, it has demonstrated that rock art sites are sacred. I mean, this is something that Indigenous people knew, but in the 60s, when all of this research started with a guy named Selwyn Dudney, that's when this stuff started like showing up, and people started realizing those are sacred sites. And connections between travel routes and rock art have been explored since the 1980s, roughly. Actually, just again, a parenthesis regarding the research, because I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but really it all started at the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, with a guy who was affiliated with the Royal Ontario Museum. So he did a lot of work in Ontario, but he also actually went to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, even Alberta, which is outside of our area of study, outside of Canadian Shield. He went to Quebec. His name was Selwyn Dewdney. Actually, if you ever go to Agawa Bay, where there's a beautiful rock art site, his ashes were scattered there. And there's a plaque with his name commemorating him as this rock art researcher. But point is that it starts in the 60s. You know, there's a buildup in the 80s. There's a lot of research going on in the 80s. Again, this is mostly Ontario, parts of Manitoba, some Saskatchewan sites. And a lot of it is done because of CRM, because, you know, they're developing stuff in the north of Ontario. And then in the 90s, it kind of goes down in terms of research. And there's like a dead period, and it kind of picked up again in the ever since 2000 and beginning of the 2000s, it kind of started picking up again. But anyway, since the 80s, they have been exploring this connection between waterways and rock art. And it was the work of John Norder in Northwestern Ontario, and actually mine as well, in Northeastern, that clearly demonstrated that there is this connection between rock art and travel routes. So what John Norder did is that he also looked at the types of social interactions that rock art could facilitate, and the types of information, general or specialized, that rock art could convey in the landscape. So building on previous work, he basically arrived, and he was armed with a very ethnographic record, with a robust ethnographic record. This is what he was exploring in Northwestern Ontario in the Lake of the Woods area. And I also got inspired by a lot of the sources he was using. And again, with the ethnographic record, I was exploring this stuff in Northeastern Ontario, how places were interacting in the landscape. So how those interactions could have taken place. So what you see on the screen here is a list of possible rock art functions. So they could have been sacred places, so places where communication with other than human persons was undertaken, where medicine men would go to practice their rituals, where individuals would go fasting, and where communal rituals could also be held. Then there is the travel aids, so help in traveling. So they helped in the navigation of the waterways. And again, there's still this connection with other than human persons, because you would be using this to help you travel, but you would be also contacting other than human persons to help you in your travel by doing a bunch of rituals, such as dropping tobacco at rock art sites to, you know, help you travel and have safe travels. And then the third possible functions would have been mechanism that structure intergroup interactions by helping to negotiate social boundaries. And rituals undertaken at rock art sites could have facilitated interactions with and the integration of outsiders. So what are social boundaries? Social boundaries are about access to the social group and their knowledge of the environment. So it's access to knowledge about the territory, you know, where are resources in the territory, how to travel this territory. So it's about that, and it's about the recreation of alliances between nations. And so those alliances, the recreation of such alliances would be carried out during ceremonies, which would take place at strategic locations in the landscape. A lot of them would have been on major water routes, in well-known conspicuous locations, at entry or exit points into the territory. So at some spots in the landscape, you would have those rituals where the social boundaries would be negotiated, and where rituals would be held for people so they can, you know, get together and share knowledge and, you know, create alliances. So all of these functions, you know, they would allow for various relationships to be created and fostered within the landscape. So rock art sites are basically like those nodes of relationships, you would go to these places and you had a chance to cultivate a relationship, whether it was with the place itself, with an other than human person, or with other humans, with other people. So, and another thing that is very important here is that we are way beyond the sacred phenomenon. In indigenous thinking, there are no strict divisions between the sacred and the secular, the sacred and profane like we have. A lot of them intertwine. So something, for example, like, traveling, which for us would be just a secular action, well, it's connected with other than human persons, which are associated more with the sacred. And, the two of them, they basically intertwine, and the sacred and the secular, they work together. So just saying that rock art sites are sacred is in a way diminishing. I find their importance and their function and for everyday life in a way. So it's much more than that, at least sacred in the way we conceive of it, as being separate from other functions in life, from other spheres of life. So these various functions that I just showed you, they would emerge from the landscape context of the rock art sites. And what was important was actually those characteristics of the rock outcrop and of the place itself. So the placement of rock art in relation to other culturally significant sites was also of great, would also determine what types of, relationships could be held at these places and what functions they would have. So, so you would have sites which would be located near other sacred sites, near effigy rock formations, and then you would have sites which were also located near paths and territorial boundaries. So this context of the landscape will have a bearing on the functions of the site. There is also, the images themselves. When we speak of rock art, of course, we think of the images. So I think that the functions can also be deduced from the image content, what is being represented, the number of images at a site, the diversity of images at a site. This would also hint at what the sites could have been doing in the landscape. And there's also the actual cliff, the properties of the cliff, what you actually see here on the screen. So, presence of cracks, of fissures, like you see completely on the left, heavy calcite deposits like in the middle. The height of the cliff, is it huge, is it small, the color of the cliff, its shape, all of this would have a bearing on a functional rock art site. And since the 1970s, it has been known that these properties are actually imbued with spiritual significance. So stuff that we might overlook actually was an indicator of spiritual charge. So for example, high cliffs, they are connected with thunderbirds. The color white, like in those white, precipitate calcite or silica streaks. Well, white is often associated, it is actually associated with other than human persons. So there's the color itself has like symbolic and spiritual connotations as well. So these properties can also at the same time render a place salient in the landscape, conspicuous. You are more likely to notice a place like that in the landscape. And just for example, this site you see completely on the right, it's a small cliff, and it's on Lake Temagami. And if you paddle, if you're in a boat and you're going a particular way, you will not see it, because it's kind of hidden and it's not a big cliff. But the moment you turn around, this, squarish rock, a diamond-shaped rock, finally, we can call it a diamond-shaped rock. It really strikes you because it's like so weird looking, it's completely different from, all the shapes of the rock which are surrounding it. So it kind of catches your attention. And indeed, there is a site here. So, but you have to be going the right way on the lake, otherwise you're gonna miss it. So, and those salient cliffs, those cliffs which are conspicuous in the landscape, they're gonna attract greater attention. They're gonna become landmarks. And as such, they can act in various contexts of engagement as places of spiritual power, beacons in navigation, or anchors for group meetings, so conspicuous places are more likely to be noticed, basically. And another thing we have to understand with rock art is, again, we are always thinking of the images, but the images are actually secondary to rock art. People would be drawn to these places to make rock art because of the actual place, of its location in the landscape, of how it looked, what kind of experiences people had at these places. And that's when the rock art came. It came afterwards. So as much as we are only thinking of the rock art, it's just one component of a rock art site in the end. And it's the place really that matters more than the actual images in many ways. So in terms of the images, what would you be seeing? And I put this on the screen because a lot of them are kind of hard to see. A lot of them are kind of faded. The meaning is very elusive and it changes over time. That's been acknowledged when it comes to indigenous rock art. And what I found, and that was actually something that I found very frustrating, because you would read all those books and all those articles, and the guy would be telling you this is what it means, and I would be like, well, how do you know? It could have been changing. It could have been something completely else. And it also depends on how you identify an image. So I was not interested in so much in the actual meaning of the images. Either way, it changes over time. So what I wanted to examine, and this is what I was doing for my PhD, is I wanted to examine the content of the images and which sites had the most images and the greatest variety of images. And around 75% of the rock art motifs in the Temagami area are the so-called abstractions. So especially lines. And you see an example of, all of those parallel lines here on the screen. So among these abstractions, so some are simple, such as those parallel lines as on the screen, while others are complex and convoluted images, such as the one in the middle, which actually is a composite image, because when you enhance the image, especially, you can see that it's different shades of red. So it seems that it's basically an collection of lines that over time looks like one image, but it must have been done over a longer period of time to actually achieve what we see today. But you have those convoluted images, those complicated, complex forms, and it's very hard to name that. So so what I was more interested in is where were those very rare representational images? Where were they located? Like images such as this bear, what looks like a bear, but again, if you enhance the image, you can kind of see the outline here. It looks like a line. Is it a tail? God knows. Or like this human figure here, or like this beautiful canoe over here. This is a very standard way of representing a canoe, this curved line with vertical streaks representing humans. And actually, when you look at the rock art and Canadian Shield, a lot of it was actually painted with your fingers, and you can literally like put your finger next to it, and you will see that the width of the line is kind of matches the width of a average finger. So it wasn't necessarily done with like brushes. A lot of it was done with fingers, and so those lines would have been great to just smear them with your fingers. So anyway, so what I was more interested is to know where those elusive representational images are in the landscape. So I followed the work of Richard Bradley. For those of you who are not familiar with him, he's a British archaeologist. He started off in the 90s looking at rock art and landscape in the UK. And he did some amazing work, and he inspired quite a lot of people in rock art when it comes to studying rock art in the landscape. So according to him, messages that rock art images convey can be more or less accessible. So access to these messages can be restricted through the image content, as well as, in the sense that only a segment of the population would be able to interpret the images. So that's one way of, constraining who knows what is being depicted, is who knows how to actually interpret those images. So it's one way of controlling access to the message. So that's what I wanted to look at, like also in terms of access to the messages that were being conveyed. So what Bradley actually argued is that the audience of a rock art site can be restricted in two ways: through the physical access. Some sites are basically buried away, hard to access. That's one way of restricting access. Or through actually how is the information contained in the image, how is it conveyed? Because some information will be easy to access and some information will be harder to access. So figures that are basically easy to interpret would more likely fall under the generalized knowledge images that would be more accessible than, for example, complex abstract figures that would be associated with specialized knowledge. So basically what he was saying is that those simple abstractions, like those lines, they would convey some sort of a general knowledge that would be understood by many people. Meanwhile, when you start getting into those unique, complex abstractions, because in UK a lot of the rock art is abstract, once you start getting into those abstract images, well, clearly there's some sort of gatekeeping when it comes to the message that is being conveyed. So it's this specialized knowledge that would be contained in those images. So those so-called abstractions, they can lead to a proliferations of meanings, especially in the case of the simple abstractions. So this is kind of treacherous, because you would think, oh yeah, they're simple to interpret, because they're simple images. But in reality, they could have had many, many different messages because they are so simple. So they would be co-opted by more people, possibly. And there would be also those restricted meanings, like in the case of those abstract complex figures. So abstract, complex, restricted message understood by few. Meanwhile, those very simple abstractions, they would have been understood by many people, but they could also have had many different meanings attached to them. So yeah, looking for meaning in rock art is kind of, unless you really know what you're, unless you really know the culture and you have some particular insight, it's kind of a dead end in a way, to be honest, because you can just speculate. And do you really have the actual meaning? I don't think so. At least I know I'm an outsider to the culture, so I would never grasp the actual meaning of those rock art images. So what do I mean by public sites? So public sites were basically conspicuous. They would be salient places. So they would be on those conspicuous cliffs, whose characteristics attested to the spiritual forces that were inherent within those places. But they would also make those cliffs visible, noticeable in the landscape. So in a way, those places could become very easily identified as a gathering spot. They are very conspicuous. The chances are that what makes them conspicuous also has sacred or spiritual connotations. And at the same time, they are visible in the landscape. So people are likely drawn towards them to aggregate there. So these sites would be located in easily accessible places along important water routes and near large aggregation where people would gather. So basically on or near big lakes, because the big lakes would be places where, people would be gathering. Let's say for the summer, there would be more people, and chances are that those public sites would be on those big lakes where there's a lot of people. So those types of places, those public sites, they would be interacted with more because of this increased human circulation and increased human proximity. So such places also provided the necessary space for meetings. So for example, there would have been a nearby ledge or a large campsite where people could gather. Even though, of course, people could have also gathered in their canoes in front of it. But there would be some sort of, spot on the land where people could probably, gather and do their thing on land instead of always being in a canoe. And these places were better suited for communal rituals. So what I want to underline is that public sites were located on major travel routes. And in this case, in the Temagami area, those would be places that lead in and out of Ndakimanan, as well as the important interior routes. And in terms of images, those places, those public sites, because they were visited more often, they would have had many varied images. We would have seen abstract images, we would have seen representational images that would convey information to the Temagama Anishinaabe as well as non-band members, so outsiders. And at least some of those images would be easily interpreted and incorporated into various contexts of engagement. So representational images might also be more likely located at these sites. It's easier to attach a story to a representational image. However, when it comes to the number and the variation of this pictorial content, these are not definitive criteria for identifying places where individual and communal rituals took place, because a site with many and varied images can be the result of communal rituals undertaken for various purposes, but it can also be possible that these images were basically created on separate occasions by individuals, and they just happened to accumulate in one spot, which was known as the best spot for vision questing, for example, which vision questing was a very personal, private ritual. So the landscape context seems more important, I think, than the pictorial content, especially since places endowed with agency would draw people in. They would attract people and to visit them and to create rock art. So again, the rock was first before the actual image was created. So the water route, the salience of the place would play a great role in determining if a site was going to be visited by many people and be public. So it was the site's location on the travel route and this route's importance within the entire hydrographic network that matter. Was this a big route? Was this an important highway, or was it like a small route? This also was important for I think, in the context of whether a site would be public or private. So a private sites, in contrast, I believe the images would be less visible. They would be more elusive. You would get more of those elusive, rare, complex abstractions, which could not be read by too many people. And so that's where you would probably find more of those images, those elusive, rare, complex abstractions. I think in many ways would be more connected with those private sites, which would be visited by less individuals. And those private sites would be the results of fewer episodes of individual ritual creation. And though, again, it's very possible that communal rituals would also be held at those locations. It's very hard to say. I mean, it can only speculate, really. Private sites would be important for a restricted audience, probably for those who were living close in the vicinity of those sites. So yes, I have those distinctions between private and public. They are not sharp, they are not permanent. The sites might have switched their functions over time. They could have been in both categories, depending on the needs of a community. But So in terms of rock art sites in the Temagami area, it's better to speak of this continuum of sites that ranged from public to private. And there are examples of communal rituals held at rock art sites. They are very rare, but they exist. And those would have been, they often would have included medicine men. So for example, there is an account from Oxford House in Manitoba, where a medicine man painted a figure of a Memegweshi on a bluff that was inhabited by those beings. And he did it in front of the community because he wanted to commemorate the fact that he received a gift of medicines from the Memegweshi that saved a woman's life. There is another story that is told by William Jones, who was an indigenous anthropologist at the beginning of the 20th century. And he basically described how people watched a duel between two medicine men. They were fighting, and they were fighting at this steep cliff at place of the Pipestone or Red Rock. And this is Nipigon, Lake Superior. And the first man, he ended up angering the Memegweshivuk, and he was substantially, eventually killed by them. So rock art is not mentioned in that account, but you know, we have that cliff that is inhabited by Memegweshi, and the Memegweshi are connected with rock art. You know, they might have created some of the rock art themselves. And actually, even though rock art is not mentioned in this particular story, there is actually a rock art site at that location. You know, there is one in that area. So it's possible that, you know, this is actually, maybe they were having this fight in front of a rock art site, and, you know, and people were participating in it. So some sites are also mentioned in missionaries and explorers' accounts because they were places where rituals and interactions between different nations took place. So for example, the rock, what you see here on the screen, has been described by the explorer Alexander Mackenzie at the end of the 18th century, and I cite, "A remarkable rock with a smooth face, but split and cracked in different parts, which hung over the water. Into one of its horizontal chasms, a great number of arrows have been shot, which is said to have been done by a war party of the Nadoasis or Sioux, who had done much mischief in this country, and left these weapons as a warning to the Chebois or natives, that notwithstanding its lakes, rivers, and rocks, it was not inaccessible to their enemies." At this site, Picture Rock, there is some striking images of animals. There's a moose smoking a pipe that is represented at this site. There's figures with horns. Horns are actually a symbol of spiritual power. There's also canoes, and there is some abstractions. And then there's the site of Rocher-à-l'Oiseau, which is a site on the Ottawa River on the Quebec side. And over there, there's been a bunch of travel-related rituals that consisted of throwing tobacco offerings. And this has been actually recorded by the French Recollet Gabriel Sagar, and also by Jesuit missionaries who traveled there in the 17th century. Some of these places were actually important enough that European missionaries or you know, European travelers, explorers would actually note them in their writings. So it's rare, but it happens. So you can just imagine how, you know, important those sites would have been if they were being mentioned by people who clearly had no interest in rock art whatsoever, or with sites like that. So and it's also worth mentioning that rock art sites were not the only salient, conspicuous, well-situated places that were sites of rituals. Effigy rocks, like the one you see here on the screen, and boulders would also be recognized as places where other than human persons could be addressed, and where interactions between various peoples could take place. So these salient rocks, they acted as landmarks. and they were located near aggregation places, and they were ideal places for people to interact at, you know, the perfect spot to gather and do stuff. So the archaeologist George Laidlaw, he wrote in 1917 about one such place. It was a rock on Sturgeon Lake in Ontario, and this lake was located on an old canoe route from Georgian Bay to Lake Ontario. And this rock acted as this aggregation point where intertribal meetings would be held. And as he described it, and I cite, just across Sturgeon Lake, there is an unusually large and round-shaped granite boulder. Not many years ago, it was high up on the lake bank beyond high water. It was a very conspicuous object. Of late years, the waves have undermined the bank, and that boulder has fallen into the water. It is now known as Treaty Rock, and the story goes that it was there that the rival tribes from east and west used to meet, shake hands, make treaties, exchange wampum belts, etc. So there are some very rare accounts that point to the fact that rock art sites located at those strategic locations, such as entry points into Ndakimenan, the traditional territory, on a major water route, could be the scene of rituals where alliances and relationships were formed and renewed. So salient places at particular spots. Rock art. So rock art centered, catered to various audiences, and it had many functions, and it would have had many functions simultaneously at the same time. But what I want to discuss is 3 sites from the Temagami area. I'm going to show you 3 sites, which I believe were public sites. So there's the Diamond Lake site, the Mystery Rock Pictograph site on Ababika Lake, and the Matachewan Lake site. And these sites are perfect candidates for public sites because they are salient, conspicuous, they are associated with important water routes, and the images tend also to be varied and let's put it, interesting. They have a lot of interesting images at these sites. So first one, the one you're seeing here on the screen, that's Diamond Lake. And Diamond Lake this site is actually located on a small lake. Diamond Lake is not a big lake, but that lake is surrounded by major lakes. It's surrounded by Lake Temagami, Ababika, and Lady Evelyn, which all were important aggregation zones. So the lake itself is part of this important interior travel routes that connect these large lakes together. And one of these routes leads to Montreal River, and what you see here on the screen with my arrows, and this connects to the Ottawa River, and from Ottawa River you get to the St. Lawrence River. So it's like this great, you know, route that you could travel on. And Diamond Lake's indigenous toponym actually refers to 5 portages that lead into 5 different directions. So the name itself, the indigenous name itself, points to the fact that, you know, travel is important. There's like 5 portages there. So what I call this site, I call it the Central Station, because it does, you know, it's like a central station that heads to major lakes, major water bodies. There's Lake Temagami, Ababika, Lady Evelyn, and the Lady Evelyn River, because there's a Lady Evelyn Lake and there's the Lady Evelyn River. So it's kind of centrally located, this site. And it's a very spectacular site, this Diamond Lake site. It has many bright images, and it has a very varied pictorial content. It's the most varied site in terms of images in the entire Temagami area. Among all of the sites that are located in the territory and not on its borders, Diamond Lake has the most representational images as well. So you can pick out actually what, you know, what is being represented. It's not only abstractions. So and Diamond Lake is associated, this site is associated with the Memeigweshivuk, who are said to dwell within the cliff. And there's like this large vertical fault in the middle of the site that could actually be kind of an allusion to a door. Actually, cracks in rocks, when you have those big cracks in the rocks, they are they are thought to be doorways, portals into the rock. You know, you could enter the rock through such cracks, and that's how medicine men would actually enter the rock and speak with the Meimei. So there's this allusion to a door actually on this site, and this site is also located on a traditional family lands of a 19th century medicine man known as Wandeban. And this can indicate at some point this medicine man had created some of the rock art images and used this site for spiritual practices. And specialized knowledge would be connected with medicine men. And such knowledge would not be contained in those ubiquitous lines, those vertical lines. That's not where this specialized knowledge would be, but rather in those rare and unique abstractions or those rare representational images. And what we have at Diamond Lake is we have some of these. There are some rare abstract geometric motifs. There's also a serpent with horns. I don't know if you can see it here, but this is kind of like a vertical serpent and what looks to be horns on its head. There's canoes, there's animals, there's human figures. And there's a lot of them, so they kind of stick out among all those abstractions which are prevalent at those sites in the interior of the territory. There's also some simple common abstractions such as tally marks. So basically there's everything at this site. And the presence of these images is actually combined with very potent physical features of the cliff. There's cracks. The fact that the cliff is white is also very important because white is a spiritually potent color. There is ample space at the top if you want to have any fasting activities, any gathering activities, you can do it. There's space and it's accessible. You can access this space. And back in the day, there used to also be falls around this lake, around this place. So there was a bunch of falls that were leading from Diamond Lake to Lady Evelyn Lake, but now they are submerged because they created a dam and they are gone. And falls, again, falls, rapids, those places also are charged with spiritual power. So this basically made Diamond Lake like this great location for building and sustaining relationships with other than human persons. It made it a great landmark along this major interior water route, and a place where other than human persons can be, maybe asked for a safe passage. And it's near major aggregation areas, so it would have been basically a great meeting spot for communal rituals. Then you have this other site, Mystery Rock Pictograph Site on Lake Obabika. So it's a major lake in the area, and it has been home to people for millennia. And this site in particular is located on a series of tall cliffs, and there aren't that many images, and the ones that are there are barely visible. It's very, very faded. But the site is important because it is located near an effigy formation, and this is what you see on the screen here. The effigies that are found at there are places in the Temagami area where rock art sites are located near effigies, and sometimes what you also see is that the cliffs, they are shaped, the rock itself seems that it's shaped like a human face. So because of the overhangs that are hanging there. But really the most famous effigy site in the entire area would be those rocks you see here, the grandmother and grandfather rocks, and they are located near the site, near the Mystery Rock Pictograph site. And Thor Conway and Julie Conway, who were doing archaeology in this area at the end of 70s, really in the 80s, they were informed that the Obabika Narrows archaeological site nearby has been occupied since the archaic period, and it was used seasonally in early fall by the residents of Obabika Lake, as well as other families of the Temagami band, who would profit from a lot of fish in the lake, and they would come to this lake to get the fish. And during that time, they would have ceremonies that were carried out at the Mystery Rock Pictograph, where this effigy formation is as well. And the site is located near other habitation sites. And there is also, you cannot see it on the picture, but there is a ledge nearby which could have held a bunch of people on it. So in my opinion, it's another great place for a public site. And it's a great example that images are not as important in defining a public site. The images are not particularly visible, but the site is a salient cliff. It's on an important interior route near where people used to live, near habitation sites, and it's near those striking grandmother and grandfather rocks. So it would have been a good spot to, you know, gather and do stuff there. And finally, there's the Matachewan site. This is a large site in the north of Dakimenan. It's located roughly on the boundary of the territory. Rock art sites are sparse in this area, and this site contains many abstract images. Again, the cliff is pretty salient, pretty conspicuous, and there's a lot of images there. Actually, it has the highest count of images in the entire area. It's at the site. And you see some geometric abstract motifs. They are very common, actually. Some of the motifs are very unique to this site. So there would have been specialized knowledge conveyed at this place as well. And across from this site, there's this nice round hill that could have been maybe used for gatherings, for communal rituals. But what really counts with this site is its location on a major travel route. It is located on what I would call a highway in a way, because in order to reach James Bay watershed and all the fur trade posts that were located within, one option was to actually travel along the Montreal River towards Matachewan Lake and then portage across the height of the land. So Lake Matachewan is on one of those possible routes towards the James Bay watershed. So it's important for when you're going north. It could have been, you know, seen by people. And so it's this like ideal liminal space to perform travel rituals, especially if someone is going to James Bay and it's going to be a long travel and, you know, possibly filled with danger. It would have been a good spot to, you know, have a travel related ritual, throw some tobacco in the water and hope, you know, thank other than human persons and ask them for, you know, to have a good journey. So in general, sites located on those major travel routes that led in and out of Dakimenan, such as Matabichuan River, this Matachewan Lake site. There's another site called Ferris Lake, which is also beautiful. Chiniguchi Lake, Stauffer Lake, a lot of the sites on Lake Anima-Nipissing, which I'm not showing you today. But those sites leading in and out are oftentimes physically salient, and they have more images than the sites on the interior routes. So there's more stuff happening on those sites, which really are on the periphery of the territory. However, as a site of entry exit points into the territory, the site is also suitable for rituals where members of various groups of various nations would negotiate social boundaries. And there is one rare account of such a ceremony in the Temagami area. And it is about, and this ceremony was held at a site that is now submerged. It's been submerged because they, once again, they created a dam, they built a dam. So the site is underwater, but it was where the Montreal River and the Lady Evelyn Lake met. So both important water bodies. So in the 1980s, there was an elder from the Temagami band who said that at this site in the past, there used to be various ceremonies held. That is, and what he said, and I cite, that is where when they gather after the war was over, I guess, and they all had a feast, all different tribes. People come here, they gather there at one time. So this is what he says about this site that no longer is, you know, there. It's been submerged. So this place would have been the scene of intertribal ceremonies that basically sought to restore harmony after a conflict. They would be there to strengthen alliances, you know, and it wasn't necessarily a sacred site like we always tend to think of sites just being for, you know, medicine men and for vision questing. So I basically showed you three different sites that I have identified as public sites. These sites had many functions. They are located on those salient cliffs. They tend to have many and varied images, and they were visited by many people, either because they were near aggregation sites, aggregation areas, or because they were located along those important highways. It's clear that the landscape characteristics, the location within the larger landscape context, this is what really helps places to emerge and become those nodes of encounter and interaction. Paths are important, routes are important, and as Tim Ingle, the anthropologist, has said, and I cite, to reach a place, you need cross no boundary, but you must follow some kind of path. Thus, there can be no places without paths along which people arrive and depart, and no paths without places that constitute their destinations and points of departure. So basically, they make each other. And for the longest time, we would only concentrate on places, and you know, routes, paths would be basically ignored, but they are just as important. And in rock art studies, images are always, you know, that's the important thing. It's the images. This is the art part that we are studying. This is what is looked at. But I advocate, and I'm not the only one who's advocating for the fact that the actual rock is actually much more important than the images. And because it all started with the rock. And so yeah, so in a way, rock art is like this total immersed landscape art that teams with activity. And you know, it's the great place for social relationships to be created and to basically foster them. And again, images are just one part of it all. So thank you.